This first one, I really want to talk about why Trotskyites become neocons. And this might not be a phenomenon you're familiar with, but it is pretty true and pretty well documented that when the neoconservative movement was beginning, a disproportionate and, in fact, it's kind of alarming amount of neocons began as sort of like Trotskyites. And I'm not trying to do the segment to indict any current Trotskyites to be like, oh, you're going to become a neocon. Because frankly, like, Trotskyism as it exists today is totally different from how it existed back then. And a big reason why is Trotskyism is based on how we relate to the Soviet Union. Like, that is a main tenet of their ideology, and the Soviet Union obviously doesn't exist anymore. So, let's get into it. Let me know if you think this analysis is spot on, but I think it kind of is. So, the foundation of Trotskyism is basically expanding the socialist state throughout the world, right? Like, Stalin wanted socialism in one country. Trotsky wanted a global permanent revolution. And this might not be the foundation per se. I said it was the foundation of Trotskyism, but it is the sticking point that made Trotskyism a distinct strain of leftism as opposed to, like I said, Stalin's socialism in one country policy. And for the purposes in this segment and in general conversation, that is also kind of the foundational difference between Trotskyites and, say, Marxist-Leninists. There's another difference I'll get into in a minute, but let me dig more on this. It's like, the idea is that if socialism is a higher form of government, and it's a new and better social formation, then it should be expanded. Remember that a principle of socialism is that everyone should be united under and entitled to the same broad sets of rights. You shouldn't be allowed to be a slave or a peasant or even an employee and subjected to the exploitation of that class status just because of where you were born. And in this way, we can kind of see Trotskyism as having the same impulses like Caesarism or Napoleonism. I guess they're more accurate words, Bonapartism maybe. I'll use that. And of course, Caesar and Napoleon have mostly negative connotations, but I don't mean this in a negative way. But, you know, Caesar, for example, was basically rapidly expanding an empire. And this is hard to conceive to a modern audience, but the expansion of the Roman Empire was more of a quote-unquote left-wing position. They didn't have a concept of left and right-wing, but the poor and working class more strongly favored expanding the empire. And the reason is many poor people in the Roman Republic were taken as slaves from other territories. They had friends and family that still live outside of the borders of the empire. And the slaves, even though they were slaves, they saw other benefits of living in an empire and wanted their people to gain some of those benefits. They also wanted to be able to go back to those people, to interact with them, to just be under the same umbrella. And so that is why poorer people wanted to expand the empire. But the rich, upper class, aristocratic Romans generally opposed expanding the Roman Republic because they saw themselves as ethnically and culturally superior to the people around them, and they worried about Romans becoming a minority in their republic. That kind of sounds a lot like a right-wing impulse today. And for example, they did not see Gauls as equals. They did not want them in part of the same empire as them. And similarly, when Napoleon was expanding throughout Europe, he was essentially exporting the new political economy, capitalism, and the similar constructions that support capitalism, like the nation state, national militaries, so-called representative democracies. And looking back, we see Napoleon as an expansionist, militaristic imperialist, and he was. But at the same time, he was perceived to be exporting a more equitable system to replace the old hereditary aristocratic regime. And ultimately, my point is Trotskyism is not the same as Caesarism or Bonapartism, because Trotsky advocated for socialism, which is, obviously, if history was completely flat, the superior economic system. And it would be a good thing to export socialism abroad. So the actual idea of exporting socialism to as many people as you can, I'm not actually opposed to that. But I have to establish that as a trait of Trotskyites. And keep in mind, again, I'm not saying all Trotskyites became neocons or will become them. Just that a lot of prominent neocons started as Trotskyites. And this also gets complicated because Trotskyites don't really exist anymore as a political force. Like, they still exist, but most people who would have identified as Trotskyites in the past are now more likely to identify as something like democratic socialists, or just generally identify as a Marxist or a communist. So on top of being Trotskyites, being expansionists regarding their economic model, they also have a disdain for the Soviet Union, especially after Lenin. And some of the more right-wing Trotskyite types nowadays would probably reject most things about the Soviet Union at any point vehemently. So, and that is the main way how they differ from, say, Marxist-Leninists. Marxist-Leninists are very pro-Soviet Union, Trotskyites are not. So how exactly did the Trotskyite-to-Neocon pipeline work? So keep in mind, a lot of the Trotskyite reaction, the Trotskyite shift happened in reaction to the Black Civil Rights Movement protests. Maybe not explicitly in reaction, but Irving Kristol, who basically is the founding father, as they say, the godfather of neoconservatism. So he was a member of the Young People's Socialist League, which was basically part of a Trotskyite anti-Soviet group. And this was in like the 40s, and he served in the military against the Nazis, and then he started writing the magazine Commentary until 1952. And he wrote a bunch of he was like part of all these other journals like that. I'm familiar with Commentary. I still hear about that one. But, I mean, at this point, like, he was still pretty much a leftist. Like, it wasn't until, like, the 60s and 70s where he really started becoming a neoconservative. And it's not exactly like he was explicitly reacting to the civil rights movement, but it's not a coincidence either, like, just to be real. Because his argument was that he thought that during the Cold War, the principles of the U.S. quote-unquote democracy was becoming more radical, and they wanted the U.S. to really clamp down on their anti-Soviet foreign policy. So basically how the shift happens is they still have this belief that the superior economic system should be exported, mixed with the hardline anti-Soviet beliefs. Well, what happens when you stop thinking socialism is the superior economic system, but you still think the superior economic system should be expanded? What do you become? A neoconservative. They basically were so anti-Soviet that they became anti-communist, but they still retained the Trotskyite characteristic of wanting to expand the economic system. And the reason they're pro-war is kind of obvious. Neoconservatives are the enforcement wing of the neoliberals. They are the ones pushing for the U.S. military to export neoliberalism to parts of the country that are not yet touched or only slightly touched by the neoliberal economic system. And you can kind of see a similar shift, and this is what I mean when I said that Trotskyites don't really exist the same way now as they did then. Because the two quintessential people who made this shift were Matt Taibbi, who's now on this anti-woke train, and Glenn Greenwald, who's just a conservative nut job now. They are kind of the equivalent of Trotskyites now. Of course, they don't call themselves Trotskyites, but they originate in a similar type of milieu, and they made a similar type of shift around the same time as the George Floyd protests. That is my segment about why Trotskyites often and have in the past become neoconservatives.